Hello, good afternoon. My name is AndreaPonce. I am going to talk about the beer manufacturing process or the brewing. The brewing process, as you can see, there has a lot of steps. But before I start, I would like to give a little bit of an introduction of what is a beer. So a beer is a fermented beverage made from malted barley and flavored with hops. So this malting process is germinating a seed so that it can be used effectively in the brewery to make sweet sugary liquid called wort, and that is the last part of the process in the brewery. So a little bit about the beer. It is also flavored with hops, which here it adds the bitterness and acts also as a natural preservatives, though other flavorings such as herbs and fruits may be occasionally included in here as well. So beer, as you might know, is the world's most widely consumed alcohol beverage, and it is the third most popular drink after water and tea. So also it is the oldest fermented beverage, and the strength of the beer is usually from 4% to 9% of alcohol by volume. So that is like an average. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about history of the beer. So beer is one of obviously the world's oldest prepared beverage, possibly going back to 9500 BC when the cereals were first farmed. And it is recorded also in written history in ancient Iraq and ancient Egypt. So there is also chemical evidence about beer process in Iran. And today, the brewing industry is a global business, and it consists of several dominant multinational companies and many thousand of smaller producers, ranging from brew pubs or brew bars to regional breweries. Now, the most important ingredients in the manufacturing of the process of beer is water, the malted grain, the hops, and the yeast. Those are the most important ingredients, and I am going to talk a little bit about each one. So water, it's 90% of the beer, and now in the past, there wasn't any filtered water, and in that time, this water was influenced greatly the flavor of the final beer, and it was specific to the region of the earth from which it came. So if it was from the mountains, it depends on the water, it had the flavor. But today, almost any water around the world is chemically adjusted, means that you can adapt the water as if you want a very high quality beer, then you can adjust the water chemically. And until you get the beer. The multigrain here is where it provides a fermentable material and is a key determinant to give the strength and the flavor of the beer. So the most common starch source is the malted grain. So malted grain is because the grain is malted, and it is by soaking it in water and allowing it to begin germination and then drying the partially germinated grain in a kiln. I will show you what a kiln is. And malting grain produces enzymes that convert starches in the grain into fermentable sugar. So here the most common malted grains are barley, wheat, and rice, which Chinese people use rice to create their own beer. And the malted grain, as you can see, it gives the strength and the flavor and also the coloring of the beer that you want to produce at the end. And the hops, the scientific name is Humulus lupulus, which in Spanish is the scientific name, and it is a flowering vine, which the flowers are used as a preservative, and for their essential oils, they add the flavor in a bittering, or it gives the aroma. So it will give the balance of the sweetness in the malt. Okay, so here, before the use, it's dried. Here are some examples of hops in the fields. And the other ingredient is the yeast. The yeast is the microorganism that is responsible for fermentation in beer. So yeast metabolizes the sugar extract from the grains, which produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, and thereby turns wort into beer. And there are two types of yeast, the top fermenting and the bottom fermenting yeast. And there are two types or two categories of beers in the world. They're called the lagers and the ales. The lager category contains the American style pale lager, Pilsner, like in Ecuador. That's why the name of our named brand of beer, which is called Pilsner, it comes from this category. Also, we have the light lager, dark lager, and the ale category, which is the ale, the porter, and the stout. Now, as you can see, the process at the beginning, it had like 7 steps, and here there's another process that has 11 steps. So the number of steps depends on what industrial or how perfect you want the beer. But mostly the industrialized companies have this 11 step. And if you want to do it in your house, like a homemade beer, it actually takes fewer steps, like 5 or 6 steps. But I'm going to show you the phases mostly of this process. And it has 5 phases to the brewing. So the first phase is the malting. The malting is where the barley is placed in boiling hot water, which releases the malt sugars within. So here, as you can see in the pictures, when the grain has a moisture content, because it has moisture content, and now it is transferred to the germination floor, which you can see in the pictures, where it is constantly turned over for around 5 days while it is air dried. It needs to be air dried in here in 5 days. Now the next phase is the milling. The milling in here is where the hops is then placed in the extracted malt sugar solution and is left to boil. Here, this is the kiln dryer, as I said before. And here the barley is kindle dried by spreading it on the perforated wooden floor. As you can see in the top picture, you can see 4 kindle dryers, and the bottom is a little closer to see how a kindle dryer is. So here the smoke coming from an roasting fireplace is then used to heat the wooden floor and then sprouted the grains in here. So the temperature is actually very, very high. It goes from 131 Fahrenheit degrees up to 108 Fahrenheit degrees. So it's really, really hot. Now, also in the milling process, the milling is the cracking of the grain, which the brewer chooses for the particular batch of beer. So depending, right? Depending on the grain that you want to use, it's the milling process. And then here the milling, it allows the grain to absorb all the water, which eventually it's going to mix in order for the water to extract all the sugars from the malt. As you can see in the picture, that is a process of milling. Now here it also takes place the boiling process, where the chemicals and technical reaction takes place, and all the boiling processes in here. Now then it comes phase 3. Phase 3 is the resulting solution is then cooled down. After the boiling part, the resulting solution of that is then cooled down, and to begin the fermentation process, which the yeast is added in. Now here in the cooling process, the wort is transferred quickly from the brew kettle through a device to filter out the hops, and then onto a heat exchanger to be cooled. So the cooling process takes place in a place called heat exchanger. So this heat exchanger consists of tubing inside of a tube of cold water. That's where it comes the cooling part. And this is very important because the yeast doesn't grow in high heat. It goes in less heat. That's why it has to be cooled down. And the hopped wort is saturated with air, essentially for the growth of the yeast in the next. So the next stage, obviously, is the fermentation, which the yeast then ferments the sugars, releasing ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. The brewer now selects a type of yeast. Remember, there were 2 types, and adds it to the fermentation tank. This is where the real magic of brewing happens, because the yeast, which is a microorganism, eats the sugar in the wort and turns it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So this process takes approximately 10 days, and this is where the wort finally becomes beer. And depending on the brewery, has its own strains of yeast, and it is largely determine the character of the beer. Fermentation is one of the most important processes in here. And now, as you can see, the fermentation types, which are humongous, depending on if you want to do a homemade. Obviously, it's less, or it's shorter. Obviously, it's smaller, and industrial, they're big, as you can see. And also, the finishing part of the brewing process is the last step, where the beer is filtered and carbonated, which means that here, that's where the beer gets the sparkling clarity, as you can see in some beers. And also the beer, after the finishing part, is moved to a holding tank where it stays until it is bottled, canned, or put into kegs. So, and also after this, it takes the filling techniques that ensure that the air does not come in contact with the beer. And now, obviously, the last part is the packaging. And the packaging is put the beer into containers, which obviously it leaves the brewer and goes to stores, to your house, or wherever it goes. And typically, the packaging is in bottles, in cans, or kegs, or casks, as some people say it. And also, it could be put into bulk tanks, like those big tanks that we saw in the pictures, for high volume consumption. And also, the beer industries have encountered two main problems. The first one is the contamination in any part of the process, and also the failure of temperature measuring device. So here, remember that there's a temperature range, top and bottom, when the yeast is fermenting, right? So if the temperature is out of range, the whole process will not happen, will not be possible to produce beer. Thank you very much.